Some people hide their dark sides so well that you can live next to violent criminals for years without realizing it. But when evil comes to light, everything secret comes to light as well. Something like this happened recently in Ecuador. The heroine of today's story lived in Sangolquí in the Pichincha province of Ecuador. Her name was Paola Ortega. The woman was the mother of 2 daughters who were 14 and 4 years old at the time of the tragedy. She and her husband ran a small business in the city center. They operated a shop in Quito, where they sold party and festive items such as balloons, piñatas, and other necessary things. Paola's entire family worked in this business. Her parents, brothers, and sisters sold and ran the shop. It was a very prosperous family that everyone in Sangolquí knew. They had been working together for many years, which gave them a solid reputation. This was mainly thanks to Paola's father, who invested in the business and didn't fail. The young business people were sociable and friendly. They raised 2 daughters, the elder of whom was from another man, but the new husband accepted her as his own daughter and was a role model for good parenting. The idyll lasted until the tragic event. On Monday, January 2nd, 2023, Paola woke up in her apartment. Her husband, Christian, was in Quito that day and planned to arrive in Sangolquí around 6 p.m. For personal reasons, the woman had been at her sales location all day, finishing her work. The workday was nearing its end. Normally, she had an assistant with her, but he was not there that day. While she was arranging the goods in the display case, 2 unknown men entered the room. When Paola saw them, she was immediately frightened, because they looked quite threatening. She felt they had come to kill her. One of the men approached the cash register and began speaking to Paola. He said he wanted to buy inflatable balloons for an upcoming child's birthday party. It was obvious he was trying to deceive his victim, as the other man was near the door, looking around attentively. Paola moved away from the cash register and indicated she needed to contact the manager. However, she didn't call the police or anyone else, but called her mother and told her about the suspicious men in the store. Her mother suggested closing the shop since it was already late in the evening and no customers were coming anyway. Her mother was already retired at that time, but promised to come to the shop as soon as possible. Paola then called her husband and told him what had happened, but he told her that the shop should not be closed, as these people looked like customers and would probably buy something. Subsequently, the mother contacted her daughter again, continuing to convince her that the shop should be closed, and left the business. However, she didn't listen and referred to her husband's words. Finally, the 2 men realized she was making a fuss and simply left. Mother managed to persuade Paola to leave the shop, and she closed it about an hour after the mysterious strangers arrived, around 7 p.m. She suggested going home and having dinner there, but Christian refused because his older daughter wanted hamburgers, and he offered to pick them up. Paola called her daughter, who replied that she hadn't asked for food, but agreed since her parents were going to buy some anyway. So, the 2 got into their pickup truck and drove to the fast food restaurant. Christian parked the car a block away from the restaurant, which was completely uncharacteristic for him, as he usually drove recklessly, blocking traffic, crossing pedestrian crossings, and ignoring traffic signs whenever he pleased. This time, however, he stopped properly and far from the restaurant. He got out, leaving his wife in the car, saying it was too cold outside and he was afraid she would freeze. Following events were reconstructed from surveillance camera recordings, among which was, coincidentally, the car of the businessman Pays. 2 unknown men approached the vehicle. Paola couldn't get out. She thought she was safe inside. The husband locked the vehicle before leaving, but when the 2 individuals approached, the headlights flashed suspiciously, indicating that the locks were unlocked and the doors were open. Paola could feel the danger inside. She realized that the attackers meant business. She quickly squeezed into the back of the cab. But she couldn't run anywhere and was trapped. The car was open, so the intruders had no problem getting in through the doors. One of them stayed in the driver's seat and called someone, while the second climbed into the back of the car and stabbed Paola several times in the face, neck, and shoulder blade. The attackers then fled, leaving the victim to bleed to death. However, she was still alive. A few minutes later, her husband, Christian Navarreto, returned to the scene. The man, however, appeared very calm. He didn't help his wife, but immediately grabbed his phone and called emergency services. To the operator's questions, he remained silent for a few seconds and then ended the call. Then he called a relative of Paula's, who turned out to be her cousin. Initially, he told him that his wife had been kidnapped, but later corrected himself, saying he had found her body with stab wounds. Cousin said the woman should be taken to the hospital immediately, to which Christian replied that he was just about to do that and ended the call. Nearby, just a few blocks away, there was a hospital where the victim could be treated. The attack occurred around 7:28 p.m. At 7:28 p.m., however, Christian called emergency services, ended the call, and then contacted the victim's family. After that, he did something else with his phone for some time. Eventually, the man got behind the wheel but did not drive to the nearest clinic, even though he knew the city well. He should have known that the nearest medical facility, open around the clock, was just around the corner. Instead, he drove to the farthest hospital he could find on the map, where a nurse knew Paula's relative. By this time, the victim was still alive but in critical condition because she had lost a lot of blood, as the blood-splattered interior of the family car revealed. Paramedics saw stab wounds on the woman's body and reported the incident to the police. Police officers were dispatched to the clinic to investigate the circumstances of the attack on the woman. Despite the doctor's help, Paula lost too much blood and died on the operating table. When the doctors informed her husband that Paula had died, he began to behave very strangely. Initially, he pulled his hair and screamed, kicked furniture, and nervously walked back and forth in the office between the window and the door. After a while, however, the man noticed the surprised reaction of the paramedics and suddenly calmed down. Christian did not cry or show any remorse over his wife's death. After the attack, the man calmly checked something on his phone and took no further action. When the police arrived at the scene, they spoke with the deceased's husband. Christian was calm and said he was lucky as he had gone to get hamburgers at the moment his wife was attacked by unknown assailants. According to him, she was clearly the victim of a robbery, as several valuables were missing. Christian stated that he had left the car locked and that Paula had refused to go with him because it was quite cold and she was tired. When the man returned, he found his wife injured and the car unlocked, whereupon he immediately contacted the emergency services and took his wife to the hospital. At this point, he was not suspected of being involved in the incident. Everyone knew the couple as respectable people who had been together for many years and had raised 2 daughters. Christian was always very close to his wife, his daughters, and his entire family. There were hundreds of photos of the young couple's happy faces in various moments. It all seemed like a true idyll and an exemplary life. However, the police first had to check the people who had last been in contact with the victim of the attack. They naturally decided to start with the husband. Investigators traveled to the restaurant where Christian said he had gone at the time of the attack. Fortunately, there were surveillance cameras, and the police officers requested access to the footage. After reviewing the footage, the investigators initially suspected the man was involved in the incident. Christian said he had locked the car and gone to get food, that he had supposedly left the engine running so his wife wouldn't freeze. However, the footage showed that as soon as he was in the restaurant, he took his car key out and unlocked the doors. This was not a casual gesture, but as if he had deliberately planned everything so he was not out of the car's control system range, still far enough away not to arouse suspicion. Criminals immediately jumped into the open car. It was as if they were waiting for his signal, and they acted too coherently. As soon as the locks were unlocked, the attackers were already near their target, and none of this seemed like a coincidence. Even Christian's behavior after finding his injured wife seemed too strange. The man hadn't even tried to help her. He had hesitated for a long time before taking her to a clinic, to the farthest one. seemed as if the man had an interest in his wife's death. After examining the scene, the forensic scientists took the victim's body to the lab for analysis. Forensic experts found 11 stab wounds on her body, most of them on the neck. This damaged major arteries, which, combined with the long wait for help, led to the woman's death. If the husband had immediately notified the emergency services about the attack, and if the doctors had arrived quickly on the scene, or if they had taken her to the nearest clinic, Paula's chances of survival would have been quite high. It looked as if the victim's husband had carefully planned the whole thing. Parked the car behind the dumpsters so it would not be visible in the neighboring streets. The perpetrators obviously knew Paula would be there and would not be seen in such a secluded place. The only problem was that they did not notice the cameras on the building, which recorded the crime scene and all their actions. Less than 24 hours after the attackers had stabbed their victim, police began considering her husband the main suspect. In the coffee shop's video footage, it was clearly seen how he went to the window and unlocked the car. At the same time, in the footage of the camera that recorded the vehicle, a headlight could be seen. This confirmed the suspicion of law enforcement that Paola had not opened the door for the attackers herself, rather her husband. The incident was initially classified as a failed robbery attempt, but nothing was missing from the couple's car. Christian told the police that his wife had been robbed of a gold chain and that the robbers had also taken $600 from her. These claims proved false. Quickly, suspicion arose that this event was a carefully planned murder. Therefore, on January 3, 2023, Christian Navarrete was arrested. The man was suspected of being involved in the attack on his wife. From the beginning, he denied any involvement in the incident and accused the police officers of not even looking for other possible suspects, focusing all their attention on him. However, investigators were certain of his involvement. Only the motive for the attack had yet to be determined. The police confiscated the man's phone for examination. Police officers were outraged by Christian's behavior in a critical situation. Instead of helping his wife and calling for help, he obviously deliberately stalled for time. The husband did not choose the nearest clinic but went to the farthest one. This approach was also considered a delaying tactic that would take away the victim's chance of survival. At this point, the wife was bleeding out inside the car. After checking the main suspect's phone, the police found that he had indeed made the emergency call. This happened almost immediately when Christian returned to his vehicle. However, after the dispatcher answered the call, he remained silent for about 2 seconds and then ended the call without saying a word. When the police officer asked him about it, he said he had deliberately ended the call because he realized he did not know the exact address of where he and his wife were located. According to him, Christian wanted to check the address on the map, but it turned out that this did not work in this critical situation due to geolocation problems, so he could not call back and give the address. His response was vague and evasive, indirectly confirming the police's suspicions. The officers then requested a list of the calls the man made on the day of the attack on his wife. It turned out that on January 2nd, he had made more than 15 calls to the same number, and it was necessary to find out whose phone number it was. Moreover, Christian made a transfer of $2,000 just 4 minutes after the attack on his wife, which also looked suspicious. After checking the account number, the investigators found it was registered to a woman. She was quickly located and became the main suspect in this case. However, the woman had a solid alibi and provided useful information for the investigation. According to her, her cousins had asked to use her bank account shortly before the incident. The men were named Byron and Mortis Castillo and resembled the men seen on surveillance footage where the victim's car was parked. Both brothers had a severe criminal record with many violent incidents. The investigation revealed that Christian had taken the men to the shop where his wife worked sometime before the incident. He took them in his car and showed them the premises of their small business, probably to plan the crime and select a location for the attack. It was determined that Christian had paid them $2,000 a few days before the attack, probably as an advance payment. A second payment was due after the woman was successfully killed, and it was made before the husband took the bleeding woman to the hospital. Police learned that the signs of the murder attempt had been established for about a month. On December 8, 2022, Paola's car was stolen. When reviewing the surveillance material, they found the same two men. At that moment, however, the investigation stalled. Police had no time to find out the names of the robbers because Christian interfered. He said the perpetrators had contacted him and offered to return personal belongings from the car. The man drove to meet them and came back with the entire contents of the trunk and glove compartment, including his wife's wallet, which contained money and cards, were obviously untouched. When the police officers learned of this, they were very surprised, as such a scenario was not typical of their work. It was unclear why Christian had not informed the officers he had been contacted by criminals. At the same time, the investigators suspected a connection between the two incidents. Car thieves had stolen the car and then became the perpetrators of the murder. Christian was aware that he was only one step away from prison and came up with a new story. He had to somehow justify the fact that he had met the criminals. This was confirmed by the police when they analyzed the location data, all three accomplices of the murder. The investigation revealed that all three had met several times shortly before the crime. When Christian was directly informed of this, he began accusing his accomplices of extortion. According to him, the family made good money, supported by their own business, and the Castillo brothers were representatives of organized crime. Therefore, they demanded monthly protection payments from Christian and his wife, and threatened to burn down their business if they refused to pay. The main suspect admitted that he had paid them protection money shortly before his wife's murder. Christian was forced to cooperate with them because they promised to harm his relatives. He didn't pay. However, he did not pay in time, so the attack on his wife is proof of the criminal's seriousness. This not only explained the personal meetings with these individuals, but also the transfer of money and the fact that he took them in his car and drove them around the gift shop. Based on the information received, police arrested the perpetrators. Byron immediately confessed that he had received $2,000 from the crime's contract, but not as a monthly protection fee, but as a down payment for the murder of Paola. He also received the remaining amount after the attack. According to testimonies, the brothers used their cousin's bank account to cover their tracks. On November 29, 2023, all three involved in the murder of Paola Ortega appeared in court, where the statements of more than 60 witnesses were collected to bring to light the truth about the relationship between the spouses and other aspects of the tragedy. It turned out that Christian was not such a good husband as the victim's family thought. For years, the woman concealed that her husband had become violent in their marriage. Christian was 3 years younger than his wife. At the time of the attack, he was 31. This insignificant difference, however, was for him a reason to mock and insult her. The man constantly called his partner ugly and old, accused her of being useless, and threatened to leave her. It became known that he threatened to take away their 4-year-old daughter. She was his biological child. Older 14-year-old girl was from another man. Although Christian had actually raised both, he loved only his own daughter and wanted to take only her. In his correspondence, the man noted that he would take her to Colombia, where he would start a new life and never see Paola again. The man's neglectful behavior was evident in everything. Paola knew he had cheated on her with at least 6 different women. Nevertheless, she forgave her husband's affairs. She carefully concealed all these horrors from her family and friends, fearing her parents' wrath. Besides, she had long feared for her husband before the tragedy, because Paola's father was a pretty tough and serious man. Therefore, he had been a deterrent for Christian for a long time. But 2 years before the massacre, Paola's father died of COVID-19, which completely unleashed Christian. After the death of his father-in-law, he stopped pretending and showed his true face. The man was confident of his impunity and his wife's defenselessness and began pressuring her from all sides. At this point, serious conflicts began, psychological and physical violence. It is worth noting that the man also hid what was happening from his family, so no one could help Paola. Christian not only humiliated the woman in every possible way, but also began to regularly cheat on her, not hiding their relationship. All this information was gathered by investigators from various sources, particularly from messengers, through which the spouses remained in contact. A series of testimonies were collected from friends of the couple, who suspected that Christian was only pretending to be an exemplary husband and loving father. When all this evidence was collected, Christian was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. This evidence was presented in court. The victim's family was shocked. Paola had hidden all these horrors of family life so well that they didn't even notice what was happening until it was too late. The family of the murdered woman was stunned by the scale of the lies and the fact that they had thought only good things about this man for years. They decided to get justice at all costs and hired a good lawyer. The first thing their defense attorney looked for was evidence of the toxicity of the relationship between the spouses. Obviously, the motive for the murder was primarily money. Paola's father had painstakingly built a business, which he bequeathed to his daughter. Christian hoped to take everything for himself and run it alone, to rob the victim's family of everything that had been achieved through hard work. The man seemed to have completely forgotten that Paola's father had been the key person in building the family business. The prosecutor's office was shocked by Christian's decision. He could have acted according to his conscience and told his wife directly that he wanted to separate. They could have divorced and then divided the jointly acquired property, even the business. Everyone could have counted on their share. Christian could not get enough. He wanted to deprive everyone of the right to run the business and gain sole custody of the child. Police found that Christian had initially wanted the murder to be committed by the helpers in the gift shop. This was supposed to happen on the same day when Paola was almost attacked by two men in the shop. However, the woman sensed that something was wrong when two strangers came in at the end of the day to buy balloons. They behaved clearly suspiciously and scared off the victim. After that, they did not continue the robbery in the shop. Christian became nervous. At that time, he was far from the scene, so the police would not suspect he had anything to do with it. However, after the call from the hired gunman, the defendant realized he urgently needed to improvise. The man urgently returned to Sangolki. Here, he looked for a pretext to take his wife to a deserted place and literally serve her to the contract killers on a silver platter. By an unfortunate coincidence, Paola's daughter agreed to the hamburgers the man had invented as an excuse to lure the victim. Christian's defense argued that he was innocent. All the suspicious behavior was somehow justified. It was a coincidence, and he was in any case a loving husband. However, the prosecution presented enough evidence to convict the man of abuse and violence against his wife. Paola's silence and her relatives' ignorance of Christian's tyranny ultimately led to the death of the successful woman. Numerous recordings from various surveillance cameras, as well as the testimonies of dozens of people, helped expose the false image of the crime's contractor. During the investigation, it was suspected that Christian had psychopathic traits. The victim's sister noted that Paola's partner's behavior raised such suspicion. She confirmed that the man sometimes behaved very aggressively towards other people. The prison psychiatrist who worked with the defendant concluded that Christian's behavior after the attack on his wife was typical of people with psychopathy. According to the expert, such people have serious problems in the emotional sphere. They feel no empathy, manipulate without feeling responsibility or guilt. The psychologist suspected that there had been conflicts in the couple's marriage that led to Christian's outbursts of anger toward his wife. Despite the numerous testimonies against Christian, the trial dragged on for almost a year. The result was conclusive proof that the victim's husband and murderers had developed a plan to kill the woman. Byron became the main accomplice and also the main perpetrator as he stabbed the defenseless victim. After deliberating on the case, the jury concluded that all three were guilty. Each was sentenced to 34 years and 8 months in prison. Although the victim's family managed to achieve justice, they have not yet overcome the bitterness of the loss. The youngest daughter, who was only 4 years old at the time of her mother's murder, remembers her well and has an imaginary friend she calls Mama. For the 14-year-old girl, the incident was a severe blow. Due to the psychological shock, she even had to be hospitalized. Paola's mother blames herself, believing she was too short-sighted to see the real circumstances in her daughter's family, and didn't help Paola. Not a day went by that she didn't remember her with tears in her eyes. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
Ashley Boccanegra, a woman in her 30s used to working nights while caring for her son, received a message that morning from a colleague who wanted to meet her. At first glance, the request seemed perfectly normal and nothing unusual, because Ashley had met him like this many times before. She was far from suspecting that this invitation would trigger a series of events that would turn her life upside down. As she quietly walked the familiar path to the meeting place, Ashley had no idea that those who had organized everything were already hiding behind the bushes. Everything seemed normal, the courtyard, the short message, and the familiar path, but every step brought her closer to the moment that would change everything. This ordinary meeting turned into a deadly trap, and her trust was rewarded with betrayal. Ashley was born on November 18, 1991, in the Bronx, a borough of New York City, and was raised by her mother Jessica, alongside an older sister. Little is known about her father, or whether he participated in her life. The family lived modestly but lacked nothing. Since her youth, Ashley was extroverted and active, took care of her appearance, and loved makeup. She liked to experiment with her look, which distinguished her from her peers. After school, she did not immediately decide on her future career and started working in retail, thinking about her future without specific goals. During this time, she met Julian, a young man with whom she quickly formed a serious relationship. They spent a lot of time together, and shortly after, Ashley learned she was expecting a child. The pregnancy was unplanned, but they decided to keep the baby and move in together. In 2014, their son was born, whose name is never mentioned as the parents decided to protect his privacy. The birth of the child changed many things. Ashley dedicated herself entirely to motherhood, and Julian, despite his young age, actively participated in raising his son. The situation in New York became increasingly difficult over time as rents and the cost of living rose. In early 2015, the couple decided to move and chose Atlanta, Georgia, where housing was cheaper, the city was less crowded, and they were closer to relatives. This move was an opportunity for them to make a fresh start. In Atlanta, they found an apartment in a secure residence with video surveillance, which gave them a sense of safety and hope for a new life. Although their romantic relationship faded over time, the couple continued to live together for the sake of their son, agreeing not to interfere in each other's private lives until the child grew up. Ashley took on most of the household chores and began looking for a stable job. She quickly found employment at a home goods store where she was offered night shifts, allowing her to be home with her child during the day and work at night. The work schedule was not easy, but it allowed her to improve her financial situation. Ashley aspired to stability and wanted to gradually become completely independent while preserving peace within the family for the sake of her son. Ashley gradually got used to night work, and since the hours were always the same, she quickly bonded with her colleagues. It was under these circumstances that she met Daniel Gonzalez. Daniel also worked at the store and had the same hours as her. At first, they only talked about work. Daniel was always helpful, accepted difficult tasks, and did not back down from any assignment. He was calm, friendly, and polite, so Ashley never felt pressured and he was always there when she needed help. Little by little, their relationship became more cordial. Initially, it involved brief conversations during breaks, which gradually evolved into deeper discussions. Ashley did not feel that anyone was pressuring her, and she felt comfortable with Daniel. He did not ask personal questions but showed interest, asked how her day went, and offered his help even when she did not ask for it. His commitment distinguished him from others. Over time, they began to communicate outside of work, exchanging phone numbers and sending messages. At first, these were simple messages discussing trivial things and sometimes planning to see each other before their shift. Their communication did not have an explicit romantic connotation. Rather, it was a friendly, natural, and simple relationship for both of them. At that time, Ashley knew nothing about Daniel's private life. Neither he nor his colleagues mentioned that he lived with a woman and children. Daniel did not mention who he lived with or hint at any potential problems. In his interactions, he seemed to be a calm and balanced person who had nothing to hide. It was later learned that Ashley and Daniel lived in the same building. This happened by chance when they discussed the exact location of their apartments. They both lived in the same secure residence, which facilitated their communication. They now met not only in the evening at work, but also during the day. Daniel sometimes helped Ashley carry her bags, picked her up from the parking lot, and walked her to her door. Ashley considered this normal help from a reliable colleague. For her, it was convenient and pleasant. At the time, she was totally unaware that he also had a family. Daniel was 27 years old. He was not officially married, but he was in a long-term relationship with Antonetta Stevens, a woman his age. They had known each other since childhood, and their families were close. They had met as teenagers and had been living together for over 10 years at the time of the events. 2 sons were born from this relationship, one 9 years old and the other 6. On the surface, their family seemed stable, but internally, things were far from simple. The relationship between Daniel and Antonetta became tense. Often, arguments over daily matters were the cause, but the conflicts often went beyond simple misunderstandings. According to relatives, Antonetta was impulsive. She could easily lose her temper and argue over trifles. This behavior was habitual and was noticed not only by Daniel, but also by those around him. Daniel did not talk about his private life with his colleagues and acquaintances outside the home. Only his close confidants knew the details. However, the constant tensions with Antonetta gradually affected the atmosphere at home. Their relationship was limited to managing daily affairs, raising children, paying rent, and sharing household chores. Outwardly, they continued to live as a couple, but their emotional closeness had faded. Around the same time, Janine, Daniel's younger sister, aged 17, moved in with them. Her move was motivated by a desire for change and clarity about her future plans. She had dropped out of school and did not yet know what she wanted to do. Her relatives hoped that living with her brother and his partner would help her make decisions and find a job. Janine quickly bonded with Antonetta. They had known each other since childhood and considered themselves more like sisters than in-laws. Daniel did not have such close contact with his sister, and she passed most of her time with Antonetta and the children. The presence of Janine did not help soothe tensions in the house. On the contrary, she witnessed arguments more and more often and gradually began to participate in them. She took Antonetta's side. According to acquaintances, Janine did not hide her opinion and believed that Daniel was responsible for all the problems. Over time, this led to a firm stance against him within the household. When Daniel began seeing Ashley, he was already living in a situation where he felt excluded. His partner was irritable, the children demanded constant attention, and his sister supported Antonetta. Under these circumstances, Daniel increasingly sought to leave the house late. He spent his time at work and stayed longer during breaks. Gradually, this became a way for him to distract himself from family problems. Although he was not thinking of changes at the time, these circumstances gradually pushed him to make new decisions. A few weeks after meeting at the store, Ashley and Daniel began to see each other more often outside of work. Their conversations were no longer limited to professional topics. They discussed their fatigue, their daily lives, and the education of their children. Ashley spoke of her son, her life with Julian, and her plan to move into her own apartment. Daniel listened attentively without interrupting her, highlighting the similarity of their situations. He spoke neither of his family nor of life with Antonetta and the children. His contacts with Ashley gradually became closer. They met before the start of their shift and sometimes chatted in the stairwell. Over time, Daniel began to stay at her place later and later. He sometimes came in the evening, helped prepare dinner, and stayed while the child watched television. All this developed gradually, without sudden change. Ashley did not ask unnecessary questions, and Daniel had no reason to talk about his life. Neither Julian nor his colleagues interfered in these meetings. She felt free, and from the outside, everything seemed harmless. At the same time, changes began to be felt in Daniel's apartment. Antonetta and Janine became increasingly attentive to his schedule. His frequent delays did not go unnoticed. Janine, always at home, noticed that her brother left the house without saying where he was going and returned later than usual. She did not know where he went, but she remembered these moments and shared them with Antonetta. Suspicion grew. At first, Antonetta did nothing, but over time her anxiety increased. At one point, Janine noticed that Daniel often spoke to the same woman in the building's parking lot. She did not know it was Ashley at that moment, but her face remained etched in her memory. Janine saw them chatting and spending time together, without apparent gestures or hugs. She drew no conclusions but observed everything more closely. While these meetings were perfectly normal for Ashley, the atmosphere was tense in Daniel's apartment. Antonetta no longer limited herself to questions. She began to check his phone and carefully observe his behavior. Her conviction that he was hiding something grew. From that moment, the trust between them began to crumble. In the summer of 2022, Daniel, Antonetta, their children, and Janine went to Florida to celebrate Antonetta's mother's wedding. The trip was planned as a week-long vacation, with a long drive and a stay with relatives. But despite the festive mood, a tense atmosphere reigned between Daniel and Antonetta from the first days. Arguments broke out even during the drive. One had not planned their day well, the other was tired, and they were just annoyed. Upon their arrival, the situation did not improve. Almost every day was spent arguing, and Antonetta's relatives noticed that the couple's relationship was becoming increasingly strained. By the middle of the week, the tension reached its peak. Arguments broke out even over insignificant details, and communication became increasingly irritable. Daniel was silent, withdrawn, and spent more time on his cell phone and out of the house. Antonetta saw this clearly, and although she tried not to let her feelings show, she could not always contain herself. One evening, after the wedding reception, while most of the guests were already resting, a conversation began that influenced the subsequent events. Daniel, tired and slightly drunk, was speaking with Janine in the garden. He said he was wary of his relationship with Antonetta and saw no future for it, then admitted to having another woman. He did not mention her name but implied that she was a colleague. Janine listened carefully but without openly expressing her opinion. This conversation marked a turning point. Janine, more attached to Antonetta than to her brother, immediately told her everything she had heard. She explained bluntly that Daniel had confessed to an affair with another woman. Antonetta reacted with unexpected calm. Instead of arguing immediately, she decided first to discover who this woman was. Preferring not to rush anything, she suggested Janine observe Daniel to confirm her suspicions. Janine agreed to support her. They decided to act only after returning to Atlanta. Antonetta remained reserved and silent on the surface. During the days following the trip, they did not clarify her relationship with Daniel, but behind this apparent calm, plans were hidden. Antonetta was determined to find out who this woman was. Upon the family's return from the trip, The atmosphere in Daniel's apartment was visibly tense. Although Antonetta and Janine no longer spoke directly about the confession, they began to carefully observe Daniel's slightest moves. They did not ask him direct questions but observed where he went, how he behaved, and who he met. Since Antonetta and Janine did not work, they spent most of their time at home. This allowed them to constantly monitor Daniel's activities. Janine noted when he left the house, who he crossed paths with at the entrance, and what he looked like upon his return. They also checked if his cell phone was unlocked. A few days after their return, Janine told Antonetta she had seen Daniel with a woman. After work, they were standing side by side, chatting and smoking. Although their behavior did not appear particularly romantic, a natural familiarity seemed to reign between them. Janine memorized the woman's appearance. Hearing the description, Antonetta immediately thought it was Ashley, the neighbor she had sometimes seen with her child in the garden. Subsequently, Antonetta and Janine decided to act. Antonetta suggested using Daniel's cell phone while he slept to send a message to Ashley on his behalf. Janine approved of this idea. They decided that this would allow them to organize a meeting with Ashley and discuss things face to face. In the morning, Daniel returned from his night shift and went to bed as usual. After a brief conversation with Antonetta, he went into the bedroom. Once he was asleep, Antonetta took his cell phone and began reading the messages with Janine. It did not take long. In the messages addressed to Ashley, they found personal messages. These included allusions to meetings and explicit language clearly indicating that they were in a relationship. This was enough to proceed to the second step. Antonetta wrote Ashley a message on Daniel's behalf, explaining that he had allegedly argued with Antonetta and had been kicked out of the house, which was why he wanted to see her. Ashley replied quickly, asking him where he was and if she could find him. Their conversation looked like a normal conversation between two close people. Ashley was completely unaware that she was not writing to Daniel. Antonetta wrote calmly without harsh words so as not to arouse Ashley's suspicions. After several messages, she proposed a meeting on the grounds of the residential complex in a small lawn between the houses. Ashley accepted. Once the date was set, Antonetta and Janine began preparations. They took Janine's cell phone to film the event. They were not armed. The plan was to lure Ashley out of the house, surprise her, and provoke an open conflict with her. The main goal was not to talk, but to use violence. The location had been chosen so as not to attract unnecessary attention. The spot was located far from the main entrances and was not fully covered by surveillance cameras. This gave them hope that no one would notice, even though they were on the residence grounds. Daniel was asleep at that time and unaware that messages were being sent from his cell phone, which would have serious consequences. Early in the morning, Antonetta and Janine left the apartment, leaving Daniel and the children at home. They hid behind bushes along the path, in semi-shade, some distance from the entrances. Visibility was limited, but passers-by could see them. They waited for a message from Ashley indicating that she was already on the street. Antonetta repeated to Janine not to turn off the recording. A few minutes later, Ashley appeared. She walked calmly, nothing aroused her suspicions. She looked for Daniel. At that moment, Antonetta and Janine emerged from the bushes. Antonetta said loudly to Ashley that she had not sent a text to Daniel. Without waiting for an answer, she immediately struck her. Ashley could not defend herself. She tried to protect her face with her hands and begged them to stop. But the blows continued. Antonetta threw her to the ground, slammed her onto the asphalt, and began to hit her with her hands and feet. She even grabbed Ashley by the hair and slammed her head against the ground. Janine filmed everything with her phone. She did not intervene, but supported Antonetta verbally, encouraging her and pushing her to be more determined. At one point, she approached and filmed Ashley's face in close-up. Ashley begged her to stop crying, but Antonetta did not stop. She continued to accuse and threaten Ashley, claiming that all this was done at Daniel's request. She even looked at the camera and ordered Janine to continue filming. Cars passed, but no one stopped. Only one car braked briefly, then continued on its way. Finally, Antonetta ordered Janine to hit Ashley too. Janine approached and kicked her several times. They then left, taking Ashley's phone and continuing to film until they left the area. Ashley remained lying on the asphalt. Her face and body were covered in cuts and bruises. Conscious, she was unable to stand for long. Then she slowly got up and walked to the house, swaying and holding her stomach and chest. The building's cameras filmed her on her return. She walked painfully. Her face was covered in bruises and she was breathing loudly. Arriving at her apartment, she went out onto the balcony and stayed for a moment, leaning against the railing. At that time, Julian returned from his morning jog. Upon entering, he immediately noticed Ashley's condition. Her face was swollen, her lips chapped, her movements slow, and her clothes covered in dirt and traces of blood. He began to ask her what had happened. Ashley refused to give details. She simply said she had been beaten by two women she did not know. She gave no names nor explained why. Perhaps out of fear or because she was in shock. Julian immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. He sat Ashley down and offered her water, but her condition was worsening. She had trouble breathing. She complained of pain in her side and head. Every movement caused her sharp pain. After a few minutes, Julian drove her to the nearest hospital. There, doctors examined Ashley in the emergency room and decided to transfer her to intensive care. Her condition was judged extremely critical. She had numerous hematomas, broken ribs, and suspected internal injuries. Doctors also diagnosed head injuries. Several hours after the assault, the police arrived at the building following a call from witnesses who had driven by and seen the fight. Officers went to the apartment where Antonetta, Daniel, the children, and Janine lived. Daniel was not home at that time. Antonetta opened the door. She spoke calmly to the police and did not seem worried. She explained that a young woman had come to see them that morning, started an argument, and assaulted her. Antonetta claimed not to know her, that she came alone and provoked the conflict. At that time, the police had no reason to arrest her and Ashley had not yet filed a complaint. The victim's identity had not yet been established. Antonetta gave them a version that seemed plausible but was false. The doctors who had examined Ashley had already informed the police of the severity of her condition. However, during the officer's visit, this information was not linked to the conflict outside Antonetta's apartment. The police left the apartment without filing a report or seizing evidence. They simply took a verbal statement. This omission left the evidence intact. At that time, Antonetta and Janine were unaware that they would soon become suspects in a criminal case. Meanwhile, Ashley's condition continued to deteriorate. As the hospital did not have the necessary facilities for neurosurgery and emergency abdominal surgery, doctors decided to transfer Ashley urgently to a specialized hospital. She was transported by helicopter to a hospital in another region of the state. A team of resuscitation doctors and surgeons was already waiting for her. Upon her arrival, she was immediately taken to the operating room. Doctors tried to stop the internal bleeding and stabilize her blood pressure, but her injuries were too severe. She suffered from a partial liver tear and massive abdominal hemorrhage. During the operation, it became evident that her injuries were incompatible with life. 1 hour after her admission, despite all the doctors' efforts, Ashley's heart stopped beating. Doctors tried to restore her heart rhythm for half an hour, in vain. At the same time, the police received a report from the hospital indicating that a patient had been admitted with signs of violent assault. This information had already been transmitted during transport, but due to discrepancies, it was not immediately linked to the previously reported emergency call from the residents. Ashley's death changed the legal assessment of the incident. The police received a report from the hospital announcing her death. Duty officers compared this information with previously recorded data and immediately concluded that it was the same case. The information regarding the victim matched the name in the medical file, and the resident file of the complex. The police decided to send another patrol to Antonetta's apartment. This time, the incident was no longer treated as a domestic dispute, but as a suspected intentional crime. A thorough investigation was opened. The police requested medical reports to confirm the nature of the injuries. Initial findings showed that they could not be the result of a simple dispute. Given the nature of the injuries, it was clear that it was a fight with many blows to vital organs. Ashley showed no signs of resistance. This means she probably had not resisted and was unable to defend herself. Based on medical reports, initial forensic examination reports, as well as recordings from the residence's surveillance cameras, a criminal case was opened. After the police confirmed Ashley's death, officers returned to the residence. Antonetta and Janine were arrested and taken to the police station. They were separated and interrogated. Antonetta answered questions calmly but said almost nothing. She avoided eye contact, spoke only briefly, and claimed that Ashley had come to her house, provoked an argument, and started fighting first. She did not mention the correspondence with Ashley, nor the fact that she had organized the meeting herself. Antonetta insisted that she had acted in self-defense. When investigators pointed out the discrepancies between her statements and those from the hospital, she remained silent. After several additional questions, she refused to speak without a lawyer. Janine, however, behaved differently. Confident and relaxed, she began to recount what happened almost immediately. She showed no signs of agitation, smiling and joking. Her story was more like a conversation than an interrogation. Investigators decided not to intervene or interrupt her. Their approach paid off. Janine recounted everything in detail: how Daniel had confessed his love to her, how she had immediately told Antonetta, how they had developed a plan for the messages to Ashley, and how they had organized a meeting. She spoke calmly about who had suggested filming everything, and how she and Antonetta had hidden while Ashley went to the meeting place. Janine also revealed that she herself had participated in the fight. She confessed to hitting Ashley several times because Antonetta had offered her help. She emphasized repeatedly that she considered it an opportune moment and had not thought about the consequences. These confessions were immediately recorded, which allowed a search warrant to be obtained. From then on, investigators knew that Antonetta and Janine had deliberately incited Ashley to beat her. Janine's lack of reasoning and calm reinforced suspicions of premeditation. After the interrogations, investigators issued a search warrant and confiscated the phones of everyone involved, including Janine's. On her phone, they found the full video of the assault. These images confirmed that Ashley had offered no resistance and that the blows were targeted and repeated. The recording contained taunts, threats, and statements indicating that the acts were planned. A message was found on Daniel's cell phone in which Antonetta organized a date by pretending to be Daniel. This was direct evidence that Ashley had been lured under false pretenses. Based on this evidence, it was decided to arrest Antonetta and Janine for murder and robbery. Both arrests took place as part of the criminal investigation. The suspects were informed of their rights and the gravity of the charges against them. Their reactions were again contrasting. Antonetta remained silent, while Janine behaved provocatively. Both arrests proceeded calmly and without resistance, under the supervision of law enforcement. Daniel only learned the news later. At the time of the arrest, he was at work. The police went to the store where he worked and informed him of Ashley's death and the arrest of Antonetta and Janine. Daniel reacted very violently. He knew nothing of Antonetta's plans, was unaware that correspondence was being exchanged in his name, and could not imagine that all this would end in Ashley's death. Subsequently, Daniel was summoned for an official statement. He confirmed that Ashley had never threatened anyone and that their relationship was not a secret. He also stated he had not given his cell phone to anyone and was unaware that a meeting had been organized via his phone. His statements matched the investigation's findings so far. Therefore, the police had no reason to suspect Daniel of complicity. Daniel agreed to participate in the investigation. The police considered citing him as a witness in court since his name had been used to trap Ashley, even though he knew nothing about it. At the end of the trial, Antonetta Stevens and Janine Gonzalez were found guilty of murder and robbery. Each was sentenced to prison time. Janine was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She was a minor at the time of the events, 17 years old. However, the court decided to treat her case as an adult. If Janine respects the conditions of detention, she could be released around age 37. The consequences of this tragedy were very serious. Ashley's son was left without a mother. His father Julian took over as guardian. Although Julian and Ashley had been separated for a long time, he was always actively involved in his son's life. Today, he fully assumes his upbringing and strives to provide him with a sense of security and stability despite this great loss. Antonetta and Daniel have 2 children. After his mother's arrest and Daniel's innocence was proven, he continued to care for his sons alone. Despite everything that happened and the shock of Ashley's death, he did not shirk his responsibilities towards his children. In the end, the tragedy touched both families. Ashley's son lost his mother, and Antonetta and Daniel's 2 children found themselves without them. Everything started in mistrust and jealousy and ended in death, imprisonment, and a difficult ordeal for children who had nothing to do with it. These events will remain forever etched in their lives, even if they were never directly involved. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves. You have likely heard many stories about teenage serial killers, such as Arati Neiman, who was sentenced to death at 15 for 2 murders, or Vladimir Nikolaev, who killed 8 people and left 10 others injured by the age of 16. Today, we are discussing a killer who began living alone in the forest at the age of 11 and started killing just a few years later. Inspired by Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, we now refer to children raised by wild animals as Moglis. Journalists gave this same nickname to the murderer we will talk about today. However, unlike his namesake, this criminal grew up from early childhood in a completely inhumane family and was accustomed to hiding in the forest after his murders. The most astonishing part is that he was still a child. He lived alone in the forest from the age of 11 and later emerged to bludgeon helpless elderly pensioners to death. Today's story is about the Belgorod Mowgli. In these difficult times for YouTubers, I am very grateful for your support in the form of likes and comments. I want to remind you that by liking this video, you are supporting my work for you, not endorsing the terrible story. The year was 2004, in the Krasnoyarsky district of the Belgorod region, Russia. On a gloomy day, an elderly man went to check on his 83-year-old neighbor, Ivan Martinchenko, also a pensioner. He immediately noticed the open gate and the door to the shed. What had happened? A few seconds later, the man was shocked. Upon entering the shed, he saw a mutilated corpse. Within just 20 minutes, investigators were on the scene. A bent knife was found beside the body. Experts determined that the unknown assailant had stabbed Ivan Martinchenko 4 times in the chest. But the murderer was not satisfied with that. When the knife bent, he grabbed a hammer and beat the unfortunate pensioner until there were no more signs of life. Who could commit such a brutal attack? And, most importantly, why? The first thing that caught the investigators' attention were the imprints of bare feet. If these were the traces of a madman, why was he not wearing shoes? What kind of savage was at the crime scene? The investigators began checking all possible theories. If it was a robbery, could the murderer have been interested in the old man's modest pension? The man had fled, spent the night there, and, upon being discovered, attacked the man and stabbed him. It turned out the perpetrator had intended to spend the night in the shed, but attacked the pensioner after being found. Why was the perpetrator barefoot? Who was he? An unemployed man? A random passerby? The investigators questioned the locals. Perhaps someone had seen a suspicious man running through the village without shoes. Unfortunately, there were no witnesses. Not even 3 days later, the local police station received a new report of a murder. The elderly pensioner Maria Salyak was found murdered in her own home. The grandmother's body was discovered by her friend. She lay on the floor, covered in blood. As the arriving investigators determined, the grandmother had been beaten to death with an iron rod. The murder weapon was found next to the body. The crime scene was completely ransacked. Silver earrings, 2,000 rubles, and the old suit of the deceased husband were missing from the house. Furthermore, the perpetrator had held a veritable feast. The dining table was littered with food scraps, and bones were scattered on the floor as if by animals. After finding footprints, it became clear it was the same perpetrator. Even valuable items were taken from the house at Akam: a watch, bags, a razor, an umbrella, and even cookies and candies. The information that a madman was on the loose in the area, attacking pensioners, instantly spread among the locals. Panic broke out. Older people were afraid to go outside, as any one of them could be the monster's next victim. The investigators began questioning the neighbors, and this time one of the men gave a statement. The witness reported seeing a young man jump over the victim's fence. He was barefoot but wearing a suit. A sketch of him was distributed throughout the region. Meanwhile, a large-scale police operation began in the forested area. Armed police officers walked in a line, spaced 10 meters apart. It seemed the criminal had nowhere to go. A few hours later, the investigators came across a hut in the forest. Inside, they found personal items belonging to the murdered Maria, which were later identified. The ruthless murderer's hideout had apparently been found. The law enforcement agencies assumed the perpetrator would return to his hut sooner or later. However, he already knew he was being hunted. A week into the search, a former district police officer came to the police station. The man wanted to chat with friends and happened to see the sketch of the perpetrator. The former officer immediately said, "That's Alexander Greba from the village of Moshchinoy." He recognized him because he had once been involved in his arrest. It turned out that Greba had been convicted of murder years earlier and had recently been released from prison. The investigators immediately went to the village of Moshchinoy, where the relatives of the suspected murderer lived. Now, it was only a matter of finding out who Alexander Greba was and why he lived as a hermit in the forest. The investigators uncovered everything about his past. Greba was born on September 23, 1980, in the village of Moshchinoy, Yakovlevsky district, Belgorod region, Russia. Alexander's parents divorced before he was 2 years old. His father, Ivan Greba, could no longer bear his wife, who constantly started fights. Valentina Greba drank, led a promiscuous life, and had hysterical fits. After divorcing Ivan, little Sasha stayed with his mother. She later remarried and even seemed to improve. With Vasily Kulinich, she had 3 more daughters, but her second husband also soon left her. During the time Vasily lived with Valentina, he loved Alexander and raised him like his own son. But soon history repeated itself. The woman started drinking and living a promiscuous life again. She no longer took care of her younger sisters because their mother was constantly on drinking binges. And when she came home, there were regular arguments. By the age of 7, Sasha Greba attended school number 2 in the village of Krasnaya Yaruga, where he was considered withdrawn. Despite his love for literature and reading, he did not take his studies seriously. In the 7th grade, he dropped out of school altogether. At school, little Sasha was accused of stealing. The family had nothing to eat, so, at the age of 10, the boy began stealing food for his sisters, but his mother was still dissatisfied. The only place where Sasha wasn't beaten and shouted at was the forest. It was quiet and peaceful there. There, the boy built a hut, which became a new home for him. He collected berries and mushrooms and learned to fish in the river without a fishing rod, using sharpened sticks. The years passed, and Alexander gradually became an outcast. At 15, a real beast awakened within him. One evening, the cold drove Alexander out of the forest. The teenager sneaked into the nearest village and hid in the first chicken coop he found. In the morning, he drank 2 raw eggs when the homeowner entered the shed at that moment. The elderly woman shouted at Alexander and reached for a stick. Later, Greba himself recounted that at that moment, everything in his head became confused, and an image of his mother appeared before his eyes. In that moment, he decided that no one would ever shout at him again. Alexander took an iron bar and bludgeoned the pensioner to death. The teenager was arrested at the crime scene. The desperate screams had brought neighbors who overpowered Alexander. The 15-year-old was sentenced to 8 years and 10 months in prison. At 25, he returned to his home village. The search for Alexander Greba, suspected of the brutal murders, was placed under special control by the Belgorod Police Department. But where was the murderer hiding after his hut was discovered? Wanted posters were hung on every post. His photo was shown on local television and published in local newspapers. And news of the murderer was not long in coming. A woman called the police and reported that a similar-looking man had come to a street cafe. The police arrived at the location only 30 minutes later. By that time, the suspected perpetrator had already eaten lunch and, according to witnesses, had gone into the forest. The officers waited for reinforcements, hoping Alexander Greba would be captured. But after some time, it began to rain heavily, washing away the man's tracks and causing the dogs to lose his scent. In all surrounding settlements, residents formed civilian squads to help search for the brutal criminal. Tension rose. A few days later, one of the locals discovered an unknown man in a cowshed and almost stabbed him with a pitchfork. Alexander had already been on the run for 3 weeks when he made news again. In the pictures, you can see a small house where 2 elderly women lived, the 73-year-old Nina and her neighbor. On that day, the neighbor came to visit and almost fainted. The yard was full of blood. The paramedics who were called took the survivor to the hospital. There, she was diagnosed with a severe traumatic brain injury and a brain contusion. The old woman lived for a few more days, then died. The investigators began to examine what had happened in the small house. The pensioners had allowed residents who had argued with their spouses or run away from home to spend the night in their house. That evening, the grandmothers also did not refuse to take in an unknown man who asked for shelter from the rain. When the investigators began questioning the residents, they showed a sketch to the driver of a local church. He explained that the man in the picture had come and asked for work, but was refused. After that, Greba moved on and found 2 old women in the same village who allowed him to stay with them. But why did Alexander kill the pensioners? There were 2 theories. Either the grandmothers had recognized him as the murderer the entire region was looking for, or he wanted to steal their money. The search for the serial killer was not interrupted for a single day. The police continuously received new reports from citizens. The criminal had been seen somewhere in a shop. The murderer had stolen a bicycle somewhere. He had undressed in front of residents somewhere. The police were literally on his heels. People were afraid to leave not only their property, but even their own gardens. Galina, the daughter of one of the residents, entered the house and saw that her mother was not alone. A stranger was there, and on the table was a half-eaten meal. She saw the madmen roaming around but did not enter. Galina began to inspect the property. No one was in the house or on the grounds. Only the shed remained. When she looked inside, the woman saw an open loft that had never been opened before. When she cautiously looked in, she saw a sleeping man. At that same moment, the stranger opened his eyes and lunged at Galina. She barely managed to run out and lock the door. The stranger screamed and tried to kick the door in, as there was no other exit from the shed. With trembling hands, the woman took out her phone and called the police. The officers arrived within minutes. With drawn weapons, they approached the locked door, ready to arrest the man. However, the perpetrator had armed himself with an axe. When the door was opened and he saw the pistol, he threw the weapon away and surrendered. The man arrested was Alexander Greba. He said, "Let me out. Get out of here." He wanted to go out, saw the gun and dropped it. He explained how he had felt at that moment. If there had been no gun, I would have fought to the last breath and killed him. But when I saw the black muzzle, it was all over. What drove him to murder? A few weeks before the series of attacks began, Alexander was released from the penal colony. The man knew no one was waiting for him at home. His mother was an alcoholic. His sisters were being raised by their stepfather. The only person close to him was his aunt. After his release, Greba went to her. After talking all night, the woman made it clear she could not take him into her apartment, as she had learned he was an ex-convict. After spending a few nights at his aunt's, Alexander tried to contact a former classmate, but she only laughed at him and said, "You were a goblin and still are one." Greba began to worry greatly and, as in his childhood, sought solace in the forest. But Alexander could not live long on berries, mushrooms, and fish. Hunger forced him to go among people and ultimately to kill. During interrogations, the madman did not even try to defend himself. He recounted all his crimes in detail, how he broke into strangers' houses looking for food or shelter from the weather, how he killed the inhabitants without hesitation. Alexander could not bear shouting. He immediately returned to his childhood. After each murder, Greba fled to the forest. There he was untraceable. He knew the forest very well. Alexander had never consumed alcohol or illegal substances. According to his own statements, he devoted all his free time to reading. The investigators noted that he was very calm during all interrogations. The investigation did not take long. Greba immediately confessed to all committed crimes and actively cooperated with the investigators. After all interrogations and investigative measures, the accused underwent a comprehensive psychiatric examination. The results confirmed that the perpetrator was fully aware that he had killed innocent pensioners. Alexander was brought to trial and sentenced to life imprisonment in Penal Colony No. 18 with a special regime known as Polar. Greba tried to appeal the verdict and filed cassation appeals to the Supreme Court. In his appeal, he wrote, "I don't know why I'm writing this. Yes, I am guilty, but I had no past. I have no present. Don't take my future away too." Previously, however, he had confessed to another crime, but the officials considered his statement false. They concluded that Greba had deliberately incriminated himself to be brought back to his homeland, where he might try to escape into the forest. It was established that the person Alexander named was not on the missing persons list. Although he had allegedly also named the location, his statement was disregarded. The confession was filed away as it was deemed unreliable. There were no such persons among the missing. Out of loneliness, Greba writes to all his relatives, his mother, his stepfather. However, Greba is still alive and serving his life sentence to this day. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. Mountain City is a small town in Tennessee where everyone knows each other, and rare events quickly become the topic of conversation. It is rare for anything to break the mold here, but one story has shaken this place to its core. It began with a family that seemed normal, if not exemplary. Behind the facade of care and love, however, something had been building up for years and finally erupted in a devastating way. No one could have imagined what the seemingly harmless girl from the house next door was capable of until it was too late. Janelle Potter was born on January 17, 1982, in a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She was the youngest of two daughters born to Marvin and Barbara Potter. Her father was a former Marine, and her mother worked as a secretary in a private company. The family lived a normal life, but the parenting methods in the Potter household laid the foundation for future problems from the very beginning. The older daughter, Christy, was 6 years older than Janelle. The relationship between the sisters was strained, largely due to how their parents treated each of them. Janelle was born prematurely and had health problems since childhood, which led her parents to overprotect her. They focused entirely on their younger daughter, watching over her every step of the way and letting her get away with almost anything. She was never truly punished, and they also tried to ensure that she always felt comfortable and happy. From an early age, Christy was forced to help her parents care for her sister, fulfilling her wishes and enduring her moods. Her parents expected obedience from her and encouraged this behavior in every way. When Christy began to express her dissatisfaction with having to spend all her time caring for her sister, her parents reacted negatively. They scolded and punished her for it. Over time, Janelle became the center of family life. Her parents praised her, gave her affectionate nicknames, surrounded her with attention, and suggested that she was special. At the same time, their control over her life became increasingly tight. Attempts were made to protect her from anything that might be difficult or stressful. This led to Janelle growing up isolated from the real world, without the opportunity to learn from her own mistakes or make her own decisions. She never had to deal with the consequences of her actions, as everything was decided for her by the adults. At the same time, the older daughter practically disappeared from her parents' sight. Christy remained in the background, even though she did well in school, played sports, and danced successfully. Her efforts were ignored. Her parents showed no interest in her life and took her successes for granted. She felt invisible and unnecessary in her own family. Thus, clear priorities developed in the Potter family from childhood. The younger daughter received all the attention, support, and care, while the older daughter was left to fend for herself. This laid the foundation for the events that later shook the entire town. From early childhood, the younger daughter was aware of her special position in the family. She quickly realized that the same rules didn't apply to her as to the others and began testing the boundaries of what was permissible. It turned out that there were simply no boundaries for her. Janelle lied regularly and faced no consequences. If she intentionally damaged or broke something, she blamed her older sister, and everyone believed her every word. Christy was punished without any attempt to clarify the situation. When Janelle turned 10, she was diagnosed with diabetes. After that, her parents' already excessive overprotectiveness crossed all boundaries. Now they literally controlled her every move. Her mother, Barbara, played the main role, while her father mostly tacitly supported her decisions. Janelle wasn't allowed to play on the street, go for a walk alone, or be left unattended even for a short time. When she started school, the girl began to have problems. She didn't understand the material, didn't work hard, and behaved passively. The teachers considered her lazy and inattentive. Her parents refused to acknowledge this and blamed everything on her health and unfair treatment by the teachers. No one scolded her for her poor grades. In the family, studying wasn't considered important. Janelle also struggled with her classmates. She often got into conflicts, lied, complained, provoked trouble, and then blamed others. Her parents regularly came to school, argued with the teachers, and demanded special treatment for their daughter. They were convinced that she deserved a special approach and that someone else was always to blame. Most teachers considered Janelle a difficult and extremely spoiled child. Some even insisted on suspending or expelling her because of her frequent tantrums and outbursts. But her parents ignored all the warnings. For them, their daughter was perfect, and everyone else was to blame. Her older sister, Christy, graduated with honors, was accepted to a prestigious college, and at the same time took a job so she could move away from her parents and no longer be dependent on them. Her parents paid no attention to her successes. All their energy went into caring for their youngest daughter. Christy was tired of being constantly blamed, and after the move, she almost completely cut off contact with her family. Over time, Janelle became increasingly withdrawn and conflicted. She couldn't communicate normally, behaved selfishly, was irritable, and short-tempered. She appeared almost everywhere with her mother, who picked fights at every opportunity and defended her daughter's interests. The Potter family aroused the anger of those around her. They were considered strange. Some felt sorry for Janelle, believing that her mother had harmed her with her excessive care. Most, however, simply tried to stay away, avoiding them. Janelle finished school with poor grades. Further education was out of the question. Barbara told her she didn't have to go anywhere or look for a job because her parents would take care of everything. Janelle was perfectly fine with that. She sat in front of the television or computer all day, and no one restricted her. Even as an adult, her parents still had complete control over her. She didn't drive, didn't meet friends, didn't go on dates, and had almost no contact with other people. She had no experience making decisions. They were always leading her by the hand and telling her what to do. She didn't understand how normal life worked, and couldn't imagine that every action could have consequences. Barbara and Marvin justified everything with concern for their daughter's illness, but Janelle herself didn't want to change anything either. She was content with everything. They didn't demand anything of her. They did everything for her, and she had gotten used to it. Her parents constantly praised her and defended her against all accusations. The family moved to Mountain City, a small town in Tennessee with just over 500 residents. It was a quiet and peaceful place where everyone knew each other and tried to live peacefully together. The town seemed ideal for a quiet life. The Potters bought a well-kept house in a quiet neighborhood. The new neighbors greeted them with interest. They came by to introduce themselves, offered their help, and tried to establish contact. Everyone was curious about who these new people were. At first, everything went quietly. Barbara got to know her neighbors quite quickly and even became friends with some of them. Over time, however, the people around her began to notice strange behavior throughout the family. At first glance, the adult daughter seemed well-mannered, friendly, if somewhat withdrawn. But if someone dared to contradict her or made a comment to her, she would immediately scream or throw a tantrum. Her mother immediately took her side and defended her, without even addressing the conflict. Her father, Marvin, often went to local bars and cafes, where he drank a lot and loved to tell stories from his time in the army. The stories sounded exciting and heroic, but it soon became clear that he made up many of them or greatly exaggerated them. Despite this, he was treated kindly and became known as a local storyteller. Janelle also tried to make friends but didn't know how to interact with people. So she decided to attract attention in other ways. She began to complain about her poor health. She said she was seriously ill, mentioned various serious illnesses, including cancer, and claimed the doctors had given her little time left. People felt sorry for her because they couldn't believe someone could make such things up. But over time, the stories changed. Janelle kept inventing new illnesses, and it became obvious that she was simply lying. When social networks became popular, Janelle created accounts on several platforms. She almost never left home and spent many hours a day online. This became her primary means of communicating with the outside world. Feeling more secure online, she began to build a fictitious life for herself. Janelle filled her pages with false facts. She claimed interesting hobbies and fictitious achievements, and recounted an eventful life. She found photos of parties, concerts, and events online and posted them on her site, deliberately choosing images where faces were difficult to recognize. She edited the photos, added captions, and described events that had supposedly taken place. Sometimes she wrote long posts about non-existent evenings that seemed believable. Gradually, Janelle gained many followers, especially among those who didn't know her personally. They had the impression that she led an active life, was wealthy, had fun, and was surrounded by friends. She sent hundreds of friend requests and soon had several thousand followers. Her posts were actively liked, commented on, and praised. She enjoyed all of this. At some point, she realized that this fictional picture was missing only one thing: a love story. So she created another account, this time under a man's name. The pattern was the same. She searched for photos online, edited them, and published them. This fake profile became, so to speak, her boyfriend. She posted in his name, sent herself compliments and cards, and left comments in his name. Many believed she really had a thoughtful and romantic young man. Some even wrote in the comments how lucky she was to have such a boyfriend. In addition to the usual social networks, Janelle registered in a local online chat that functioned like a forum. There, the townspeople discussed local news, exchanged opinions, and wrote anonymously or under a pseudonym. Potter occasionally visited it but wrote almost nothing. This platform was of less interest to her, as she couldn't invent stories about herself there. The locals knew who she was, and in reality, she didn't live up to the impression she made online. Janelle was almost 30 when she found her first real friend. Her name was Tracy Green. She was born in Mountain City, worked in a pharmacy, was intelligent, and sociable. Thanks to this friendship, Janelle began to socialize at least a little. They went shopping together, walked in the park, sat in cafes, and talked on the phone every day. Janelle's parents didn't mind this friendship and were even happy that their daughter had found a friend. Tracy often stayed at the Potters' home, and the family welcomed her. Janelle enjoyed this company. For the first time, she didn't have to arouse sympathy or make something up to get attention. Tracy soon began introducing Janelle to her friends and relatives. Communication was no longer limited to the two of them. Now they often met in a group. Among the new acquaintances was Tracy's brother, Billy Payne. He was young, educated, attractive, and easygoing. Thanks to his keen sense of humor, he quickly became the center of attention in any social gathering. Janelle was very attracted to him. For the first time in her life, she truly liked someone, but Billy didn't reciprocate her feelings. She didn't know how to flirt or act casually, so she behaved pushily, demanding attention, and becoming angry and extremely emotional when she didn't receive it. This behavior repelled him. He found his sister's friend strange and stopped contacting her. Janelle began obsessively stalking Billy, sending him private messages and constantly being wherever he was. A month and a half after they met, he officially announced that he was dating a woman named Billie John Hayworth and introduced her to his friends as his girlfriend. From that moment on, he hardly appeared in his old clique anymore and spent all his free time with Billie Jean. Janelle couldn't accept that he hadn't chosen her and began behaving like a petulant teenager who wasn't getting what he wanted. She demanded that Tracy intervene and make enemies of her brother with his new girlfriend. Tracy refused, which led to a fight between the friends. Later, rumors spread around town about a possible wedding between Billy and Billie John. Everyone talked about how well they were suited. The residents even shared their opinions in the town chat. Most were genuinely happy for the two of them, everyone except Janelle. She considered this a personal loss and began plotting revenge. Later, Janelle reconciled with Tracy and asked her to help her with her personal life. Tracy agreed and introduced her cousin Jamie Curd to Janelle. He was around 30, worked as a programmer, and lived nearby. Despite his age, he was aloof, somewhat strange, and not particularly popular with women. At first glance, he and Janelle might have been a good match, but she had completely different goals. Janelle didn't intend to start a serious relationship with Jamie. Instead, she resorted to a ruse. She invited him to her home several times, ostensibly to help him with his computer work, telling her parents each time that he was an excellent professional she couldn't live without. Soon, Barbara and Marvin began inviting Jamie to lunch, and afterward, he often came to their house. After some time, Janelle confessed to her mother that she liked Jamie, and after her parents' approval, she announced that they were now a couple. From that moment on, they appeared everywhere together. In fact, she had no real feelings for him, but only hoped it would make Billy jealous. She deliberately came to Tracy's family dinner with Jamie, hoping to show a new side of herself, but nothing went according to plan. During dinner, Billy unexpectedly announced that he and Billie John were getting married. What's more, Billie John was already expecting a child, and they didn't want to postpone the wedding. For Janelle, this was a blow. All her fantasies and hopes were shattered, and instead, a vengeful and destructive scenario began to develop in her mind. A few days later, insulting rumors about Billie Jean spread through the town chat. Topics. Someone wrote that she had allegedly led a dissolute life, had many affairs, was being treated for sexually transmitted diseases, and had now decided to trap Billy with her pregnancy, even though, according to the anonymous author, the child wasn't even his. Of course, none of this had anything to do with reality, but in a small town, such rumors spread quickly. Some brought up the topic again and again and wouldn't let it die down. Insults, accusations, and hostile comments towards Billie Jean followed. Despite all the commotion, Billy didn't believe a word of it. He continued to support Billie Jean and tried to protect her from the attacks. When it became clear that the online discussions were pointless, the couple contacted the police and filed a complaint for defamation and harassment. At the time, they didn't know who exactly was behind all these attacks. Although the participants in the city chat wrote under pseudonyms, it was no problem for the police to find out who was behind the offensive postings. After it became clear that Janelle was responsible for spreading the lies, Billy and his girlfriend filed a lawsuit and obtained a court order prohibiting Potter from approaching them or contacting them. But that wasn't the end of the matter. It was just the beginning. Janelle created several fake social media accounts from which she sent threats to herself. She then showed them to her parents and said she feared for her life because Billy and Billie Jean were supposedly planning to kill her. Her parents believed their daughter without hesitation and reported the incident to the police. However, the investigation revealed that all the threats had been written by Janelle herself. Despite this, her mother and father continued to believe her version of events and ignored the investigators' findings. The hostility between Janelle and the couple, against whom she harbored a grudge, escalated into a protracted conflict. Every encounter on the street ended in an argument, insults, and mutual accusations. All parties repeatedly contacted the police, demanding that contact be limited. This continued for almost a year. From the outside, it seemed as if the tension had subsided. In fact, Janelle had simply changed her strategy and decided to avoid open conflict in preparation for more serious action. Around the same time, Janelle's mother Barbara received emails from a man named Chris, who claimed to be a CIA operative. He claimed to have information about an alleged assassination attempt on Janelle, which Billy and Billie Jean were behind. According to him, the Secret Services had no reason yet to arrest the couple, but the situation was very serious. The emails were sent not only to Barbara. Later, Chris also began writing to Marvin and Jamie Curd. He assured them that Janelle's life was in danger and that she could be killed if urgent action was not taken. The agent repeatedly emphasized that everything had to remain secret and that it was pointless to wait for help from the police. Within a few months, Chris managed to gain the trust of Janelle's parents and her boyfriend. They wrote to each other regularly and discussed how to save Janelle. Later, the agent announced that the couple were apparently looking for a hitman to eliminate Janelle and that immediate action was necessary. He sent instructions detailing exactly what to do. On the morning of January 31, 2012, Marvin and Jamie arrived at the house where Billy and Billie Jean lived with their 8-month-old son Tyler. The family was still asleep. The men entered through a ground floor window and went into the bedroom. Marvin had a gun with him. He walked over to the bed and shot Billy in the head at close range. Billy died at the scene. The shot woke Billie Jean. Not understanding what was happening, she ran to the nursery to protect her child, but the attackers followed her. She managed to hold her son in her arms, but was then shot twice in the head. The young woman died at the scene. Fortunately, the child was unharmed. After the attack, the men fled the house. Neighbors who heard the shots called the police. Officers arrived quickly and found a horrific scene. In one room lay the body of a man with a gunshot wound to the head. In the other, a small child sat next to the bloodied body of his mother. The first clues immediately led the police to the Potters. Given the long-standing conflict between the families, the officers quickly focused on them. Initially, Barbara and Marvin denied any involvement, but after interrogation, they admitted to the agents' messages and their involvement. They also mentioned Jamie Curd, who they believed had helped protect Janelle. A technical review of the IP addresses revealed that the CIA agent emails had been sent from a computer located directly in the Potters' home. The sender was Janelle herself. Her story collapsed when the technical evidence came to light. Nevertheless, she continued to insist on her version, but no one believed her anymore. All four were arrested. Jamie Kurt agreed to a deal with the prosecution and described in detail how the murder had unfolded. He claimed that he sincerely believed he was saving Janelle and had not known that Agent Chris was a fictional character. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Marvin Potter was found guilty of double murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole. Barbara was convicted of aiding and abetting a crime. She, too, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The main perpetrator, Janelle, who was confident of her impunity and believed she had everyone wrapped around her finger, was also sentenced to life imprisonment. She had planned the double murder in advance and decided to sacrifice the people closest to her who trusted her unconditionally. Thanks for watching, and take care.